Hello friends, very good morning and welcome to the EduSide Network. Our today's topic of discussion is Women Writers of America, and this lecture is part of our series on American literature. And we have this in our studio, our subject expert Dr. Bhim Singh Daya, who has been steering, in fact taking care of the series on American literature. And Dr. Bhim Singh Daya, he, after a long time as a professor of English at Kurukshetra University and Vice Chancellor Kurukshetra University, he is presently acting as an advisor to a well-known university institute in India. And with this introduction, I'd like to welcome Sir to our EduSide studio. Thank you so much for coming, sir, and I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you. Yes, the topic for today is Women Writers of America. Yesterday we had Black American drama and just 3 important dramatists we touched upon. But today the list is longer, and we have 13 women writers to talk about. We will have to be brief, of course, keeping in view the number. But then one thing is common between what we did yesterday and what we are going to do today. That is the discrimination against women has been almost as much as against the blacks. If you look through the history of American literature or the syllabi in different universities, you will find very little space for women writers compared to men. And mostly in the university syllabi for MA and MPhil, we find just one Emily Dickinson mentioned or prescribed. The rest just ignored or given a footnote and so on. So that is one limitation of the readers in India also, because in the universities we have been teaching just Whitman or Frost or Henry James or Hawthorne, Hemingway, so on and so forth. But seldom these women writers, poets as well as novelists. So we begin today with the earliest of women writers, who was in Bread Street, A-N-N-E, in Bread Street, B-R-A-D-S-T-R-E-E-T. Well, she was poet in the 17th century, as early as that, when America was not yet an independent nation. She wrote poetry, and very pleasant surprise that she has the feminist streak, and she is speaking for women and speaking very clearly and very loudly. The book of poems that she published was titled Contemplations. Well, I would like to read out some of the lines which are very important. They come from his poem on Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, of course, died in 1603. Whereas in Bread Street was born in 1613, 10 years after the death of the Queen. But then she found inspiration in the Queen for women, that here is a woman who could rule England and rule with glorious achievements. So here are the lines I would like to read. Now say, have women worth, or have they none? Or had they some, but with our queen is it gone? Nay, masculines, you have thus taxed us long, but she, though dead, will vindicate our wrong. Let such as say our sex is void of reason No, it's a slender now, but once was treason. Now, this is very forthright, very bold, and particularly you note how she addresses men, you masculines. So that is significant. And keeping in view the early times, 17th century, when America itself was a colony of the British, and there was hardly any education for women. And here comes in Bread Street with a clear vision about the gender discrimination that the American women were suffering. Well, the next in the line is Sarah Wentworth Morton, S-A-R-A-H, Sarah Wentworth, W-E-N-T-W-O-R-T-H, Morton, M-O-R-T-O-N. Now, with Sarah, we move into the 18th century. Well, she was also a poet, and she was known actually as the Sappho of America. Sappho, just to tell you briefly, was a Greek poet soon after Homer. And Homer, you know, was 3,000 years ago, around 10th century BC. 1000 BC. And she comes sometime in the 9th or 8th century BC, a Greek poet, woman poet, imagine. So don't think women have been lacking behind in any field. Even as early as 3,000 years ago, here was this great poet in Greece, Sappho. And this American poet, Sarah Wentworth Morton, she was known as the Sappho of America, or American Sappho, because she wrote similar kind of sweet and very haunting kind of verses, and all readers of sensibility understood her as Philenia, 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 because of her warbling eloquence, as they called it, warbling, W-A-R-B-L-I-N-G, warbling eloquence. And she was inspired by the German writer, poet, you know, one of the greatest poets of Europe, Goethe. Goethe was leading poet in the late 18th and early 19th century. Even the Romantics in England, they drew inspiration from Goethe. And the book that particularly inspired her was The Sorrows of Young Werther. The Sorrows of Young Werther, W-E-R-T-H-E-R, with liquid rhapsodies. So this poet Sarah is also rhapsodic, both in her prose as well as poetry. So in the 18th century, we had this one significant poet, but there were two novelists in the same century, women novelists. One was Susanna Rowson. Susanna, S-U-S-A-N-N-A, Rowson, R-O-W-S-O-N, who published in 1791 her famous novel Charlotte Temple. Charlotte, C-H-A-R-L-O-T-T-E, Charlotte Temple. Well, the novel has an interesting story. There is an English girl who is attracted by a young man from New York, and they fall in love. But then she finds herself deceived when she reaches in America. not only that he doesn't marry her, he leaves her with a child and she dies in childbirth, the kind of stories we hear even today. So, and this story, by the way, is based on an actual story. It is historical that way. And the person whose story it is was an important one. He was, say, Charlotte Stanley, Stanley, and because he was an important person, the story remained not much talked about during his days. But then later it grew into a legend. And Susanna had the courage to write about that story, and in a way writing for the cause of women. So you can see in the 17th century as well as 18th, as early as that, the women writers were feminists, and they were speaking for the gender, and they were highlighting the discrimination and the atrocity or the oppression of women in the American society. Well, similarly, in the same century, 18th, we had Hannah Foster, Hannah, Hannah Foster, Foster. She also published a novel in 1797 called The Coquette, 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 which again is based on an actual story, and the story is similar. The only difference is that here the girl also is American, not British. But then the story is the same. The boy deceiving the girl and the girl dying in childbirth again. So the two novels have very similar stories, and both are based on actual historical happening. Here too there was an important person involved. He was actually the trustee of Yale College, most important college in New England. He was the trustee. And it is the story of Elizabeth Whitman, the actual story of Elizabeth Whitman, who suffered at the hands of this trustee of Yale. And one thing common about both of these novels is that they are written in the manner of Richardson, the 18th century British novelist, one of the pioneers of the English novel. And a special thing about his novels is that he wrote novels in the letter form, epistolary method as it is called. So these two women novelists of America in the 18th century, they also used the epistolary method of narrative, and they revealed the whole story through letters. So that brings us to the 19th century. In the 19th century, you have four writers, the important ones. Out of four, again, one is poet Emily Dickinson, very well known, canonized, included in every syllabus, and the reason is that she is not overtly a feminist. She is writing her private thoughts, expressing her private emotions, living a secluded life, and in fact she never thought that she would publish her poems, and she didn't. It was only later, after her death, that the poems were published. So they were private thoughts. But then one thing clearly comes out. Although by inclination she was a Puritan and she was a spiritualist, inward-looking woman, living life of the soul and living privately, not participating much in public. But as you read through the poems, one thing clearly comes out, that she is not happy with the Calvinist religion, which means the American Puritanism, and also comes out in subdued voices that it is inimical to women. Calvinism is not fair to women, it is oppressive. And the subtext of her poems reveals that angle also. So it is important to read the subtext. Generally, it is ignored, and we take her as an isolated, inward-looking Puritan poet, but it is not just that. There is much more which we need to read between the lines and look into the subversive text which is there. So Emily Dickinson is the one poet in the 19th century among the American women writers. As for the novelists or prose writers or editors, there were several kinds, but they had important roles. One of the important women was Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller. She was one of the group headed by Emerson, the Transcendentalist movement in America, where you had Emerson, Thoreau, Walcott, and partly Melville and Hawthorne. Melville and Hawthorne, of course, were dissenters, but then they were essentially transcendentalists, all of them. Whereas in Hawthorne and Melville, you have the negative side of transcendentalism. In Emerson and Thoreau, you had the positive. And as I had said earlier in our lecture on the transcendentalists, these writers, the entire group, they were highly influenced by the Hindu thought, the Indian thought, particularly the Bhagavad Gita, which was being recommended by Emerson to everybody, then by Thoreau, and Thoreau uses it in his writings also. So Margaret Fuller too was conversant with Bhagavad Gita, and she edited for the group the journal, the Dial, which she did for 4 or 5 years. So that was important journal because it was in the writings of this journal that the manifesto for the new movement, transcendentalist movement, could be seen. So she was in a way a policy formulator, Margaret Fuller. And she also had a companion in a way, Elizabeth Peabody. Elizabeth Peabody, Peabody. Elizabeth Peabody, by the way, was the sister-in-law of Hawthorne. And she had some influence on Hawthorne, particularly in the Scarlet Letter and his later writings. And the influence was for having a different look of women and the question of gender. That's why we find in the Scarlet Letter Hawthorne, places Hester Prynne at the center, and she emerges as a heroic character. He attributes heroic qualities to her, whereas the male character, her lover, that priest, he turns out to be a timid man. She is bold enough, and she says, if we don't have freedom here, let us go away to Europe, across the seas, and we will live a free life. But then he develops cold feet and withdraws. But then the picture of, say, Hester Prynne, the heroic picture, the contribution, I would say, is largely Elizabeth Peabody's, because she would argue with Hawthorne and she would influence him through her discussions. So Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody both made a sort of companionship, and both shared these views about women. And they were speaking to the entire group of transcendentalists about the position of women. That's why in Emerson, Thoreau, Walcott, we find they are more emancipated so far as the woman question is concerned, and they are not really very discriminatory. So these two women had this contribution. They were neither poets nor novelists, but they were writers, and they were editing this journal, The Dial, and through the journal expressed their views. Well, another writer in the 19th century we need to remember was Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. That novel, of course, made a mark. Millions of copies published. And for the first time, the question of the blacks, the Negro Americans, was raised, and very sympathetically raised. And it is remarkable to note that it's a woman who is raising it, not the male writers. She did it. So women writers, we find, are largely speaking for the oppressed. It may be women, it may be the blacks, that they are the ones who are writing about discrimination in the American society. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, through Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom is a very pleasing black character, an old man, but a very humanist sort of character, and very warm to everybody, and you forget the color while with him. So Harriet Beecher Stowe is known for only this work, although she did several others, but it was so predominant that people forget to even mention others. Another writer of the period was Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton. She was a novelist, and very much similar to Henry James. Not only that she was a contemporary of Henry James, but both were similar type of novelists. They were called novelists of manners. Their kind of novel is called novel of manners. You see, for them, more than morals, more than social or political issues, it is the manner, culture. That's why Henry James is all for culture. And he didn't think his own country was cultured enough. That's why he traveled to England and settled there and wrote about the European culture. Here you find that Edith Wharton is doing similar kind of things. Her important novels, The Age of Innocence, for example. She is again, like Henry James, writing about aristocracy, so which was now dying out. So both Henry James and Edith Wharton, they capture this dying culture of aristocracy in America, and they immortalize that culture through their novels. The most important, of course, is The Age of Innocence. Then Emily Dickinson, we have talked about already a good deal earlier also. the only poet of the 19th century, and in fact of the entire range of American literature, who is canonized, who is accepted in the American histories and the syllabi on American literature as one of the major poets, always mentioned with Robert Frost, because they were contemporaries, partly late 19th century and largely in the 20th. So this completes the 19th century scenario of the American writers. Now coming to the 20th, you have more women writers, but then the more important ones were, to begin with, Amy Lowell. Amy Lowell was one of the early 20th century, after World War I. You know, when modernism begins, the modernist phase. So she was one of the theorists. And like Margaret Fuller, she also edited a journal. And the journal was called Imagist. Imagist with E at the end, French. Imagist poets, as they called themselves, Ezra Pound and Amy Lowell. Both were theorists. Ezra Pound was more domineering, more loud, but then she was more, convincing and more logical in her arguments. A better theorist, I would say, of Imagist poetry. And you know, as a part of the modernist movement, the emphasis of the Imagist poetry was to focus on the image rather than the statement. They said poetry has to be visual. It must rely more on image than on statement. A statement goes better in prose rather than in poetry. So they made poetry more and more visual by using metaphors, by using symbols, by using analogies, by using myth. So that is what, you know, Eliot and Pound and other modernists were doing. Sorry. So Amy Lowell had that role to play as a theorist of Imagist poetry and of the modernist movement. Later, of course, Pound and Amy Lowell, they fell out because he was difficult to suffer, the kind of dominance he would impose on everyone. And then out of frustration he would say, oh, she is not much of an imagist. It is not imagism, it is Amyism. Amyism rather than imagism. Anyway, but she had very important role to play, as I said. And another important woman writer of the early 20th century is Willa Cather. Willa Cather comes again after World War I, and she wrote novels about the World War also, because the World War I was a shattering experience, you know, for the entire Western world. And America had participated for the first time in a world war and had emerged as a major player, of course. But then the younger generation, they were disenchanted. Hemingway, you remember, and that's why they are called a lost generation, because the shock of war was sort of knockout for this generation. And Willa Cather pictures that shock in her novels. A Lost Lady, for example, one of her novels I like best. There you find that woman protagonist lost between the two worlds, the one that is gone and the other yet to emerge, as Matthew Arnold would say. So caught up between the two, and how this transition brings about the stress, the tension, the oppression. So all that is pictured in that Lost Lady. And then about the World War as such, Death Comes for the Archbishop, that novel. Death Comes for the Archbishop. So that pictures the World War seen just as Hemingway did in A Farewell to Arms, and then post-war and The Sun Also Rises. Similarly, Willa Cather does in this. She wrote, of course, about a dozen novels, very prolific writer, as much as Hemingway, in fact, even more. And more spontaneous, which Hemingway is not in his later novels. Early novels, of course, are very spontaneous. But then in the later ones, at least 2 or 3 of them, he seems to be laboring, which Willa Cather does not. She remains with the same rhythm and spontaneity, even in her later novels. Now, another name that comes to mind, thinking of 20th century American women writers, is Pearl Buck. One book made her famous, The Good Earth, which is not about America nor about Europe, it's about China. And the way Chinese people suffered the natural calamities and the conditions of poverty, starvation, and so on. So an epic novel, very gigantic in its dimensions, and picturing the whole vast scene of China. Imagine an American doing it. She was an outsider, but then she had the advantage of being an outsider. She could be objective, she could distance herself from the scene, but at the same time a powerful rendering of the narrative. And that book made her famous all over the world. In fact, this is one book I was reading through the American history of literature, and it mentions that in at least 10-12 Indian languages this was translated, Bengali, Hindi, southern languages, so on and so forth. This is the American history mentioning. It was so popular a book world over, and quickly it was translated. In India, much more popular than elsewhere. So that's about Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. And similarly, an equally popular and great novel was Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, again a woman writer. Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind. It is about, of course, the American Civil War, which had happened in the 19th century, 1865. But then belated history, but a very powerful one. And of course, it is eulogistic in a way that she has a heroic protagonist who emerges as the war hero. There is nothing feminist about it. It's a male protagonist. But then it made an impact all over the world. And you must have seen the movie also, Gone with the Wind.
Yes.
A very popular movie the Hollywood made, and made a lot of money. And the last I would talk about quickly now, summarizing, is Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein also belongs to the same phase between the two wars, 20s, 30s, and she was a little senior to Hemingway. But then her role, like Margaret Fuller and Peabody, was more of an advisor and a theorist. So she was a theorist of modernist literature and an advisor to the younger writers like Hemingway or Willa Cather and so many more. She was living in Paris, and she also wrote books, of course, but neither fiction nor poetry. General books like The Making of Americans, very famous book she wrote, The Making of Americans. In fact, later when Hemingway and she fell out, she would always say, Hemingway became a writer by proofreading my books, The Making of American and other books. But then Hemingway did acknowledge that she would correct him in his English and taught her a lot of things, how to make the narrative effective. So as an advisory person in the whole scenario of modernist movement in America, Gertrude Stein had a great role, and expatriate writer in America. That's why all of them found Hemingway, Fitzgerald, James Joyce, everybody who went to Paris because they were running to Paris. Paris at that time was the center or home for the artists. The kind of freedom they did not find in America or England, they found in Paris. So all of them would go there, and Stein would provide the center. She was the central figure for all this group of expatriate Americans in Paris. So there I stopped. Now you may have some questions. So
absolutely, sir. Absolutely, sir. We have time, and I would definitely like to ask you a question. And I would like to, sir, make an observation and also request you to say, correct me and advise me where I may be wavering. Say, sir, as you mentioned, and we started the transition, say, from 17th century writers, and we moved on to so 20th century American women writers. So what we could note in the 17th century is that the women are, the feminist streak has started arising, it started speaking for the women loudly, and so the works were primarily, say, concerned with putting across an image of women and trying to put forth the fact that they need to assert themselves and come forth and ask for their rights, and that was the main preoccupation in these works. But as time progressed and we move, say, to the 19th and 20th century, this woman question was one of the issues that was raised. It was perhaps not the predominant issue any longer as we move from the 17th to the 18th, 19th, and then the 20th century, because you mentioned that other issues also became important, such as the idea of war in Willa Cather's novels, and Paul S. Buck, who's talking about say how issues came up in China and how the people dealt with starvation, etc. So can we say that within the 17th century, women writers of America were primarily concerned with developing their feminism and also putting it across to the readers that the women need to assert themselves? But as the time progresses, gradually this question could have taken a backseat, and other issues are also coming along with that. And
well, you are right. See, they were more vocal in the 17th and 18th century. Perhaps they needed to be, because conditions were much worse then. But then the woman question remained burning for a long time. The discrimination against women, both in England and America, continued as late as 20th century. You see, even until World War I, 1914, 1918, women had not been given the voting right, both in America and England. Although the working class people, factory workers and so on, they had been given voting right in 1865 in England. And in America, the blacks after the Civil War, they had got equal rights, but not women. And women had to come out in the streets. They had to agitate. In fact, they had to go to prisons also. And it was as late as 1922 that they got the voting right, both in England and America. Imagine 1922. If you remember in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, there is an old American couple, and in a conversation the American woman says, yeah, I voted for prohibition, and I voted for the voting right for women, so on and so forth. So it was as late as 1922. So woman question was important, but somehow these writers like Gertrude Stein and others, they were elitist writers, to be frank, and living in Paris and so on. So they had more international outlook rather than concerned with the American problems. They had now the world problems. Their outlook was much wider. Even Hemingway, for the first time, you find a really international novel coming from him. Although Henry James had initiated, but then there it was very simple, Europe, America comparison and so on. But in Hemingway, the locations are outside America in all of the novels. It's a real international novel where, without any self-consciousness, international characters, communities, they mix up and are facing a common problem of a world war, how things are going to be for mankind in future. So the perspective had become more internationalized, outlook had become broader. That's why you are right, it took a back seat. Not that the discrimination was over even by the 20th century. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for that explanation. And sir, as we have been discussing, this idea has been part of our previous lecture also, that women and also black writers did not form part of anthologies, say the anthology of American literature or the history of American literature. Could we say that there has been a considerable improvement in that trend, or do women writers, except for, say, you took the name of Emily Dickinson, that she could find a place in these anthologies, but so many women writers that deserve the attention, the mention, could not make their place in those works?
Yeah, very rightly. Even today, you look up the syllabi of Indian universities in English, wherever all universities, of course, are not teaching American literature, but at least as option, most universities do. But then the set of writers we teach has been the same for the last 200 years as I see it. You see, you have the same Emerson, Thoreau, then Hawthorne, Melville, and then you have Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and just Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost. So Emily Dickinson is the only one who finds place in the entire syllabus. Out of 12 authors, just one woman writer. Why not others? There are very significant writers, but they are ignored. Unfortunately, in our universities, we are also guided by the American canon. Whatever they teach, we teach. So that colonial, despite our movement of post-colonialism, we continue with the same mindset. The only post-colonialism in our view is that rather than British and American, we also include Indian literature and Commonwealth literature. And that is all right and very good, we should do that. But then, so far as American and British writers are concerned, the canon continues to be the same as it was handed over to us by the British when they left.
Right, sir. And with that, sir, I was just interested in finding out, say, We talked about Anne Bradstreet, who's a poet of the 17th century, who's writing when in America was not an independent nation yet. And then we have Sarah Wentworth Morton, who is writing post-independence. So, sir, could we note any significant changes within the writers after the independence?
Well, I find these 17th and 18th century, these two poets, Anne and Sarah, they are much more courageous. Imagine the colonial situation in which both are writing, because independence came 1776, late 18th century. They were writing before that, and even then, they could raise their voice and address men as masculines and so on, and telling them to their face that we are no less, and it is scandalous, it is slanderous the way you have been talking about us and thinking we have no reason, so on and so forth. So the later writers, I find, do not feel it as agonizingly as these early poets did, particularly these two poets. The later ones, of course, do depict even Emily Dickinson, but then it is muted, and also it is more indirectly there rather than direct. But in these two early poets, there is a direct address to men and telling them to their face that you are not being fair to us.
Absolutely, sir. And sir, as we talked about these novels which were based on real life, you gave us two examples. One was Charlotte Temple and one was A Coquette. And you mentioned that they were based on real life, how women were deceived by these men who promised to marry them but left them with a child, and then these women died in childbirth. And sir, my question is that were these novels deliberately written to draw out the hypocrisy that was that women were subjected to and the women had to endure, and the writers wanted to bring out that experience and also to point out to the men that what is happening is wrong?
Exactly. And again, you see, very bold of these women. Imagine the real stories, and real stories of people who were prominent, who were privileged, who were powerful, and yet writing those stories, the stories were still fresh in people's mind. They knew the real story behind, and yet they had the courage to write it. So I would rather prescribe these novels rather than inane kind of writing that we do here, recommend for our students. So we need to radically recast our canon and our syllabi to give legitimate place to these writers. Americans would not, because it exposes their society,
Absolutely.
their hypocrisy. But why should we continue to protect them? We must highlight and must give importance to such works rather than the canonized one by the Americans.
Absolutely, sir. And so you told us that Hannah Foster and perhaps even Susanna Rowson, they followed the epistolary style when they were writing novels through letters.
Yes.
And was this a popular style at that period, sir?
Not really, not very popular, but then Richardson, had an important place along with other writers, like who was the other one? You had in the 18th century when the novel began, there were others writing in the straight narrative, but Richardson was the only one who wrote in the epistolary method. But then it was popular with some people because letter writing has its own charm.
Definitely.
Particularly, women, because letters were sort of secret. That's why you find Richardson also writes about women in distress And here again, the central character is woman in distress. So it suits also because they do not have the freedom to talk about openly. Therefore, they will secretly write letters about their life. So it is suitable to the theme also. So it very well goes, it blends with the theme, and I think their choice was very right, remarkable.
Absolutely, sir. Sir, we talked about Edith Wharton, and they were writing about the aristocracy and capturing the dying culture of aristocracy, and within that, did the woman question figure significantly in her writings?
Not really, because she is very much like Henry James, and both are hung up with the concept of culture, that life must be educated, cultured, sophisticated, and we must have values different from the common people. Now it is, as some critics would call it, aristocracy of sensibility. See, they are creating a different kind of aristocracy of the elite, of the educated, of the intellectuals, and looking down upon the common people, just as the rich people would do. Similarly, these people of sensibility, they look down upon common people. Therefore, they do not really share the problems common people faced. The discrimination on the basis of gender, for example. So it's not a very disturbing question to them as it was to the earlier writers.
Absolutely. That was a very wonderful discussion. So we had I wish we could have gone on, but we have drawn to the close of our lecture. And so I would like to sincerely thank you, sir, for being here. And of course, our students must know that our series will continue and have a few more lectures. And with this, I'd like to say thank you to all the viewers. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.